Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going back to the 1970s.
Ooh, the 70s.
A pretty pivotal period for Indigenous communities in the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah.
So, buckle up because we're going to unpack some landmark legal victories that reshaped the fight for their rights and sovereignty.
It's a fascinating era.
It is.
We'll be looking at a history podcast episode
Oh, cool.
to kind of examine how Indigenous people skillfully used litigation to secure these wins, and they still resonate to this day.
So it's not just like dusty old court cases, but about understanding how these legal battles set the stage for like the activism we see today.
Absolutely.
Wow.
1970s were a turning point.
Okay.
We're going to see how in both the U.S. and Canada, tribes began to reclaim their power and control over their lands and their resources.
Okay, let's dive in. I know the history of mineral rights on U.S. reservations is a bit of a minefield itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pun intended. The system was designed to benefit corporations, often leaving Indigenous communities with unfair contracts and minimal compensation for the resources extracted from their own land.
So it sounds like the deck was stacked against them from the start.
Unfortunately.
But I understand the Northern Cheyenne tribe in Montana really turned the tables in the 70s.
They did.
Wow.
Initially, they received a pittance for the coal being mined on their land.
Oh, wow.
But through sheer determination and legal savvy, they won the right to renegotiate their contracts in 1973.
Wow, what a David versus Goliath situation. How did they manage to pull that off?
Well, it proved that tribes could leverage the legal system to gain economic justice.
Okay.
They secured fairer compensation, setting a powerful precedent for other tribes seeking to reclaim control over their resources.
That's a really crucial point.
Yeah.
This wasn't just about money, it was about asserting their right to self-determination.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
They were no longer willing to accept exploitation.
This seems to have been a time of significant legal breakthroughs.
It was.
I know there's also the landmark U.S. v. Wheeler case in 1978.
Indeed.
What happened there?
This Supreme Court ruling was a game changer.
Huh?
It affirmed that tribal sovereignty isn't a privilege granted by the government, it's inherent.
Okay.
So imagine tribal sovereignty like owning your home.
Okay.
It's yours by right, not because the government allows it.
So the government can't just decide to revoke tribal sovereignty on a whim.
Exactly.
Right.
The court made it clear that only Congress has the power to diminish tribal sovereignty,
Gotcha.
further solidifying the concept of self-governance within tribal lands.
These victories are truly inspiring.
They are.
But I'm also mindful that the road to justice for Indigenous communities has been long and arduous.
Yes, it has.
The struggle against the Peabody Coal Company by the Navajo and Hopi comes to mind.
That's a prime example of how winning in court doesn't always translate to immediate relief.
Right?
Peabody had been operating on Navajo and Hopi lands for decades, extracting coal with devastating consequences for the environment and local communities.
It wasn't until 2005, decades later, that Peabody was finally ordered to cease operations.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of the challenges Indigenous communities face in holding powerful corporations accountable.
Right.
Even with legal victories, the damage inflicted often takes years, even decades, to address.
It makes you wonder, how do we ensure that corporations are held accountable in a way that prevents harm in the first place?
That's a question with no easy answers.
Yeah.
But it highlights a key takeaway from this era. The fight for Indigenous rights requires constant vigilance and a willingness to challenge those in power.
Okay, so we've seen how tribes in the U.S. started asserting their rights in the courtroom. Now, let's shift our focus north to Canada, where a parallel movement was unfolding.
Okay.
What were some of the key legal battles there?
One of the most significant was Calder v. British Columbia in 1973,
Okay.
a case brought by the Nisga'a Nation to assert their Aboriginal title to their ancestral lands.
And I understand this case had a truly groundbreaking outcome.
It did.
Tell me more.
For the first time, a Canadian court formally acknowledged that Aboriginal title predates European settlement.
Wow.
Justice Judson famously stated, "The fact is that when the settlers came, the Indians were there, organized in societies and occupying the land as their forefathers had done for centuries."
It's almost as if he was saying, hello, we were here first.
Exactly.
But this recognition must have had huge implications, right?
Absolutely.
But,
Like,
yeah.
while the Calder decision didn't automatically grant the Nisga'a ownership of the land, it fundamentally shifted the legal landscape.
Okay.
It was a crucial step towards recognizing Indigenous rights as existing independently of the Crown.
So it set the stage for future negotiations and land claims.
Precisely.
Okay.
In fact, the Nisga'a Treaty of 1999, which finally settled their land claim, wouldn't have been possible without the groundwork laid by Calder.
That's incredible.
It is.
It's like a ripple effect, with one legal victory paving the way for another.
Exactly.
And this momentum continued.
Yes, with another groundbreaking case in Canada, Justice Thomas Berger and the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry in the 1970s.
Okay.
Imagine a massive pipeline proposed right through Indigenous lands.
Talk about a potential disaster. What happened?
Well, Justice Berger led a thorough inquiry into the pipeline's potential impacts.
Okay.
What's remarkable is that for the first time, Indigenous voices were not just consulted, but placed at the forefront.
They weren't just an afterthought.
Absolutely not.
Wow.
They were key participants in the inquiry, sharing their knowledge and concerns about the potential environmental and cultural devastation the pipeline could cause.
And what did Justice Berger ultimately recommend?
He recommended a 10-year moratorium on the pipeline's construction.
Yeah.
He recognized the potential for irreparable harm to both the environment and Indigenous communities.
Wow, what a bold move. Did the government actually listen?
He did.
Oh, wow.
Prime Minister Trudeau accepted Berger's recommendation. It was a watershed moment, demonstrating that Indigenous perspectives could influence national policy, even against powerful economic interests.
So we're seeing a pattern here in both the U.S. and Canada. Indigenous communities, through tenacity and legal expertise, are starting to turn the tide in the fight for their rights.
Yes.
But these legal battles must have been incredibly challenging, both logistically and emotionally.
It was a period of intense struggle and resilience.
Yeah.
But it also marked the beginning of a profound shift in the relationship between Indigenous communities and the legal systems of these two nations.
What a fascinating start to our deep dive.
It is.
We've seen how Indigenous communities in both the U.S. and Canada began to leverage the legal system to assert their sovereignty and fight for their rights.
Yeah.
But as we know, the journey doesn't end there.
It doesn't.
So stay tuned, because when we return, we'll explore the complexities that persisted despite these victories, especially in the United States.
It'll be interesting, for sure.
Stay with us. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been tracing the incredible legal victories of Indigenous communities in the U.S. and Canada during the 1970s. But as we know, winning in court doesn't always mean the fight is over.
That's right. The struggle for Indigenous rights is often a marathon, not a sprint. Even with landmark legal wins, challenges and complexities persist.
Like, that brings to mind the Navajo and Hopi's long battle with the Peabody Coal Company.
Yeah.
We touched on it earlier, but it's worth revisiting.
Absolutely. Remember, Peabody was ordered to cease operations in 2005.
Right.
But this victory came after decades of environmental damage and exploitation on Navajo and Hopi lands.
So while they won in court, they also experienced a profound sense of loss.
Precisely. The land, their sacred connection to it, and their way of life had been deeply impacted. Their fight highlights a painful reality. Even when Indigenous communities secure legal victories, the process can be agonizingly slow, allowing harm to continue for far too long.
It kind of underscores the idea that justice delayed can feel like justice denied. It's also a stark reminder that legal victories are only one piece of the puzzle.
Indeed. It raises crucial questions about how we ensure corporations are held accountable for their actions swiftly and effectively, preventing harm before it occurs.
Yeah, it's a question that resonates deeply today, especially as we grapple with issues of climate change and corporate responsibility. But these legal battles also invite us to consider the different lenses through which history is interpreted. You mentioned various schools of historical thought earlier. Can you elaborate on how they view these legal battles and their impacts?
Of course. Each school offers a unique perspective, enriching our understanding of these events and their lasting significance. Let's start with the Indigenous school of history.
Okay, what's their primary focus?
They see these legal victories, like the Northern Cheyenne's successful renegotiation of their mineral contracts, as a powerful affirmation of Indigenous self-determination.
Okay.
It's about reclaiming control, not only over resources, but over their own destiny.
So it's about much more than winning a specific case. It's about regaining agency and power after centuries of dispossession and oppression.
Exactly. These victories are seen as stepping stones toward a future where Indigenous communities have the autonomy to govern themselves and manage their own affairs free from external interference.
That makes sense. Now, what about the revisionist school? How do they interpret these events?
For them, it's about challenging the dominant narratives that have often excluded or marginalized Indigenous voices and experiences. They view these legal battles as a necessary confrontation with systems of power that have historically ignored or trampled on Indigenous rights.
So it's about setting the record straight,
Uh,
exposing the injustices of the past,
yes,
and pushing back against those who have benefited from those injustices.
precisely. They see these legal victories as a way of holding governments and corporations accountable for their actions, forcing them to acknowledge the harm that's been done.
It's about demanding recognition and demanding justice for past wrongs.
Exactly. Then we have the progressive school, which brings a different but equally important perspective to the table. They're interested in the socioeconomic implications of these legal battles.
So they're looking at how these cases affected the everyday lives of Indigenous people, their economic well-being, and their access to resources.
Exactly. They highlight the systemic inequalities that many Indigenous communities face and see these legal victories as part of a larger struggle for social and economic justice.
It's about fighting for a more equitable future where Indigenous communities have the same opportunities and resources as anyone else.
You got it. And finally, we have the environmental school.
Okay.
As you might guess, they're particularly interested in the environmental aspects of these legal battles.
So they're focusing on how these cases help to protect Indigenous lands and waters from exploitation and degradation.
Precisely. They see cases like Justice Berger's Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry as groundbreaking for Indigenous environmental advocacy, showing that Indigenous knowledge and concerns can influence national policy and protect the environment.
Because it set a precedent for how governments can incorporate Indigenous knowledge and respect their deep connection to the land.
Exactly. They argue that these legal victories helped establish important precedents for future environmental justice movements.
It's incredible how these different schools of thought each offer a unique lens through which we can understand the complexities of these legal battles and their long-term consequences. It reminds us that history is never simple.
Absolutely. It's not about picking one perspective over another.
Right.
It's about recognizing that there are multiple interpretations, each offering valuable insights.
It's about appreciating the nuances.
Yeah.
The different layers of meaning.
Yes.
And the interconnectedness of these events.
Precisely. As we've seen, these legal battles weren't just about specific cases or legal principles. They were about larger issues of power, justice, and the future of Indigenous communities.
It's a powerful reminder that the fight for Indigenous rights is far from over. Welcome back to the Don't Dive. We've been on quite a journey, exploring the landmark legal victories of Indigenous communities in the U.S. and Canada during the 1970s.
It's been fascinating to kind of witness their resilience and how strategic they were using the legal system to fight for their rights and their sovereignty.
And we've seen how those victories continue to inspire activism today.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, as we wrap up, what echoes of these 1970s battles do we still see playing out in the 21st century?
A lot of the core issues are still relevant.
Really?
Yeah, Indigenous communities are still fighting for control over their lands, resources, and cultural heritage.
So even though there were major legal breakthroughs in the 70s, the struggle is far from over.
Absolutely. The fight for treaty rights, environmental protection, and self-determination continues.
Can you give us some specific examples of how these issues are, manifesting today?
Certainly. Consider the ongoing battles against pipeline projects like the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock.
Right.
These protests directly echo the resistance we saw in the 1970s against projects like the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline.
It's like history is rhyming, with new players and higher stakes.
Indeed. And these modern movements often draw inspiration and strength from the legal precedents set back in the 70s.
So those victories, even though they might seem like distant history to some, are still shaping the landscape of Indigenous activism today.
Absolutely. Those legal wins provided a framework, a language, and a sense of possibility for contemporary movements.
Yeah.
They demonstrated that change is achievable even when facing powerful opposition.
It's a torch being passed from one generation to the next, illuminating the path forward.
That's a powerful image. And it's not just about legal strategies. The historical perspectives we've discussed, those different schools of thought, continue to inform how we understand and engage with Indigenous issues today.
So it's not just about remembering what happened, but about actively learning from it and applying those lessons to the present.
Precisely. The Indigenous School of History, with its emphasis on self-determination, continues to inspire communities to assert their sovereignty and fight for their inherent rights.
And the revisionist school reminds us to constantly challenge dominant narratives and center Indigenous voices in our understanding of history.
Right. And the progressive school compels us to address the persistent socioeconomic inequalities faced by many Indigenous communities.
And of course, the environmental school highlights the indispensable role of Indigenous knowledge in protecting our planet.
Each of these perspectives offers invaluable insights into the ongoing struggle for Indigenous rights and justice. They remind us that these issues are complex, multi-layered, and deeply intertwined with historical legacies.
So, as we absorb all of this information, what does it mean for us as listeners? How can we be better allies to Indigenous communities?
The first step is simple yet profound.
Mm.
Truly listen to Indigenous voices, understand their perspectives, and respect their knowledge systems.
It's about amplifying those voices and supporting their struggles in meaningful ways.
Exactly. And it's about educating ourselves, challenging our own assumptions, and unlearning any biased narratives we may have internalized.
It requires a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the past and present.
Indeed. And ultimately, it's about taking action.
Okay.
Support Indigenous-led organizations, advocate for policy changes, and use your voice to stand up for justice and equity.
It's about recognizing that the fight for Indigenous rights is a collective responsibility. We all have a role to play in building a more just and equitable world.
Well said. As we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. The legal victories of the 1970s weren't just about specific cases or legal principles. They were about reclaiming power, asserting agency, and paving the way for a future where Indigenous communities can thrive on their own terms.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just something we read about in textbooks. It's alive, it shapes our present, and the choices we make today will impact generations to come.
Let's choose to stand on the side of justice, respect, and understanding.
Yes.
Let's choose to be allies in the ongoing struggle for Indigenous rights.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a pivotal era for Indigenous communities. We hope it's inspired you to learn more, think critically, and take action in your own communities. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world for all.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.